Today we're going to look at editing for conciseness. Instructors put word or page count restrictions on assignments. This compels students to write clearly and concisely. However, this can be tricky when discussing the nuances of complex topics. To help you address this, we're going to go over a variety of strategies that can help you reduce word count. In this video, we're going to be looking at how verbs and using specific verb forms can help you reduce your word count. With that in mind, we're going to first look at modals. We're also going to look at using infinitive forms versus gerunds, which we'll explain in detail. We'll look at using passive voice versus active voice and how the verb form changes there. We'll be looking at progressive forms of verbs with the ing, the participle verb. And finally, we're going to be looking at negative forms of verbs. Let's begin by looking at the modals. Auxiliary modals are verbs that can indicate ability. However, verbs such as am, is, and are often increase word count. Using can, in some instances, reduces the word count. Let's take a look at an example. Hercule Poirot is able to solve almost any murder. Here we have the phrase is able to. We put this in a modal form and we're talking about having the ability to solve. But we can reduce this 9-word sentence by replacing is able to with can. Hercule Poirot can solve almost any murder. Here we use the verb can and reduces that word count to 7 words. In academic contexts, we might write strength-based interventions are able to improve confidence. In this context, we got 7 words and we're using that modal form are able to. When we remove that and use the word can instead, the sentence is now only 5 words. Likewise, student-centered pedagogy is able to enhance student outcomes. Again, we have is able to, we've got 8 words. If we use can in place of is able to, we reduce that to 6 words. Now, on to infinitive forms. Infinitives are verb forms that function like a noun phrase. Infinitives typically include the preposition to paired with a verb. However, gerunds can often be used in place of infinitives. Gerunds are noun forms of verbs ending in ing, the participle verb. Now, this might be a little confusing if you're not familiar with these terms, so let us take a look at a few examples in practice so you can understand the difference between an infinitive and a gerund. Some murderers prefer to use poisons. Here we have to use. This is the infinitive form of the verb use, and that creates a 6-word sentence in this context. If we use the gerund ing form of the verb, it reduces the word count. Here, some murderers prefer using poisons, and we have 5 words instead of 6. In academic contexts, we might write, some teachers prefer to use multiliteracies approaches. Again, we have the infinitive form and 7 words. If we instead say some teachers prefer using multiliteracies approaches, now we have the gerund version with the ing form, and we only have 6 words. On to passive voice. Passive voice is used in instances when the subject is being acted upon. Using active voice in some instances can decrease your word count. Example, the crime was solved by Sherlock Holmes. In this case, we have was solved, and this is the passive form because the crime, which is linked to the verb, is not actually carrying out the action. Rather, the object, Sherlock Holmes, is carrying out the action on the crime. This requires 7 words in this context. If we make Sherlock the actor of the sentence and the subject, now we use active voice. Sherlock Holmes solved the crime. And now Sherlock is acting on the object and Sherlock is connected to the verb. That makes this active instead of passive voice, and we've got fewer words. In an academic context, you might write the Beck Depression inventory was completed by the participants. Now, the participants are carrying out the action, but it's the inventory that is the subject. And therefore, we're in passive voice and it's using a total of 9 words. What happens though if we make the participants the subject of the sentence? Well, here we say the participants completed the Beck depression inventory, and now completed is an active form, and we've only got 7 words, thereby reducing the word count without removing any of the substance of what we're saying. However, active voice isn't universally shorter. If the focus is on process and not the actor, active voice can actually increase word count. In these cases, passive voice can often help reduce the word count. For example, here we have Sherlock Holmes used deductive reasoning to solve the crime. Now, in this context, we have 9 words in total. Deductive reasoning is our focus, though, not Sherlock Holmes. We're focusing on the methods used to solve the crime, so we can strike out conceivably the actor in this context and omit them from the sentence altogether. Deductive reasoning was used to solve the crime. Now we've removed Sherlock Holmes. We put this in the passive voice because the actor isn't in the sentence at all. And now we bring it down to 8 words. In academic contexts, you might say that Ali et al. Administered the state trait anxiety inventory. We have the state trait anxiety order is the focus of the sentence, even though Ali et al. Are the subject. This is 9 words. If we simply focus on the state trait anxiety inventory and say that it was administered, now we reduce the sentence down to 6 words. Now, on to progressive forms. In conditional contexts, which is instances when you're saying if or when or establishing a condition, people sometimes use progressive tenses. When we use progressive tenses in conditional context, we need an auxiliary verb such as is, am, are, and we need the participle form of the verb, the progressive form that ends in ing. For example, somebody might say, never be on the business end of a gun when it is going off. This last element, when it is going off, is the condition. And that creates a total of 14 words in this sentence, but you'll see we have both an auxiliary verb and the participle verb. And if we simplify that verb form, we can reduce word count. We write never be on the business end of a gun when it goes off. We use simple present tense instead of the participle verb, and we bring it down to 13 words. In academic context, you might write a double-blind process was used when the researchers were collecting data. Now, in this context, we have were and collecting. We have the participle verb paired with the auxiliary verb. It's 11 words in all, but let's try to reduce this. Double-blind process was used when the researchers collected the data. Now we have simple past tense in this context. We've removed the participle verb or the progressive form of that verb, and we've reduced the word count to 10 words. Now finally, let's look at the negative forms of verbs. Negative tenses usually have an auxiliary verb paired with an adverb that denotes a negative tone. Simply using a negative form of a verb or adjective can eliminate the need for the adverb. Now, some of this metalinguistic phrasing might be a little confusing. So let's take a look at practical examples of when we put verbs in the negative and see how we can reduce the word count. Here we have, it is not a good idea to reveal a plot twist on a book's cover art. Now here we have not a good. So our verb is at the beginning, it is, but then we put it in the negative form by saying not. However, instead of saying not a good idea, we might say what it is instead, and thereby reduce the 16 word count to something a little smaller. Is a bad idea to reveal a plot twist on a book's cover art. Instead of saying it's not a good, we use simply bad, and we reduce the word count to 15. In academic contexts, we might write something like the participants were not comfortable with answering some of the questions. We have the negative form of were with the adverb not, and then we say comfortable. That is 9 words in total. However, if we change the word comfortable to uncomfortable, we eliminate the need for that negation. The participants were uncomfortable with answering some questions. Now it's only 8 words. So let's do a quick summary and cover all the things we just looked at. First, we want to look at modals. When we're talking about people's ability to do something and we're saying are able to, consider using the word can in place. That can reduce word count. Infinitive forms of verbs, to run, to read, to swim, can often be reframed with gerunds, reading, writing, understanding, and thereby reduce word count. We also want to look at passive voice versus active voice. If the actor is central to the meaning of the sentence, we want to typically keep that in active voice to reduce word count. If we're focusing on process methods or tools, we might instead put it in passive voice and remove the actor altogether to reduce word count. Use your critical thinking skills to determine which is most effective. We look at the progressive form of verbs, especially as they appear in conditional tenses. Consider simpler forms, simple past, simple present, in place of the progressive forms when talking about conditions. And finally, we have the negatives. Sometimes when we put something in the negative form of the verb, is not, will not, cannot, we attach it to something that's framed in the positive, right? So instead of saying not able, we say unable. Instead of not comfortable, you say uncomfortable. Hopefully these tips will give you some ideas as to how you can write concisely and clearly by considering the most optimal verb form in your context. If you have any questions on that, leave them below. We'll be sure to answer them as quickly as possible. And if you want some other tips on how you can write concisely, check out our other videos on how to reduce word count. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.